Welcome to Leadership Explored, the podcast where we dive into what it really means to lead in today's world. I'm Ed Schaefer, joined as always by my co-host Andy Siegmund. Have you ever looked at a project dashboard where everything was marked green? The timeline looked good, the budget was on track, and everyone seemed confident. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, right before a major deadline, the status flips to red. We call this a watermelon project. Green on the outside, but red on the inside. And while it often feels like a surprise to leadership, it's rarely a surprise to the people and team doing the work. So today, we're unpacking why the gap exists. Is it optimism? Is it pressure? And how do we build a culture where we make it safe to tell the truth and show the red before it's too late? So Andy, I'm curious, looking back at your career, have you ever had a project where you were confident it was on track and then been surprised to find out that it wasn't?
Well, how honest do you really want me to be with this answer, Ed?
I mean, whatever comes to mind for you. What do you think?
Um, so with a project that I've been actually leading, no. Have I said a project is on track while knowing it isn't on track? I'm going to plead the fifth on that, and I think that's a big part of what we're going to get into. Here, Ed. Before we kind of dive in, right? I think it's worth saying that like tracking risk on a project is super complicated, right? There's some art and there's some science to it, and I'm really looking forward to kind of jumping in and parsing out what's art, what's science, what's real, what's vibes, and how psychological safety plays a huge role in all of this.
Yeah. Well, when I wrote this initial question to ask you, I was thinking about it myself and I was like, have I ever been confident about a project and then been surprised to find out it wasn't? And I think like my short answer is no. I don't think I've ever been surprised to find out that it wasn't on track because usually you can tell some risks are boiling up or something is at risk for a really long time. I will say that I think what has happened to me sometimes is that I thought it was on track, or maybe optimistically thought it was on track, and then discovered that some dependencies or risks were more realized than I thought they were. So I have had something that I thought was like maybe a low risk turn into a high risk pretty quickly. But I don't know that I would say it was a surprise unless the news was a surprise, right? Like, oh, we thought this hardware was going to get delivered for this server to be stood up, and there's a month delay from the vendor or whatever. Like that's a pretty big surprise. But that I don't, for me, I don't think that's the
Yeah,
same thing as like knowing it's red and calling it green the whole time.
yeah, I think that that's a really worthwhile caveat to put out there, right? Like I've been surprised by what I'll call non-controllable issues, right? A dependency that was supposed to be met gets not met because somebody got sick or left the organization suddenly, or a piece of hardware that you were told is going to be delivered on a Tuesday is actually going to show up in December or whatever that is, right? Those are outside of the bounds. But I think what we're trying to talk about today and trying to confine the scope of this conversation is within our controllables, right? Within like our known knowns, not our unknown unknowns, to paraphrase.
Yeah. When I kind of said it in the intro, but just to make sure we're on the same page and we're kind of everybody who's listening is following along. When we talk about a watermelon project, and you might have heard the phrase before, and if not, I'm glad we get to share it with you today because I know it made me laugh. The very first time I ever heard it, I definitely was like, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about because I've seen it before. But it's any project where it's green on the outside, but you slice in and look inside and it's actually red. And usually with those, they've been red for a really long time, but they're reporting as green and nobody knew or nobody wanted to mark it as green. And then it's like I mean, usually with a watermelon project, like I said in the intro, it is you get towards like, oh, we're 2 weeks away from production release, and by the way, this project has now flipped to red. Whereas if we had flipped it earlier, probably be able to do something about it sooner. So I think of watermelon projects really as like a reporting mismatch, right? The dashboard or all the reports say that it's green, that it's on track, but the reality is that there's a bunch of risks behind the scenes that nobody is calling out or highlighting or taking seriously. And so I guess one of the key characteristics that I can think of with these is that it's the absence of yellow, right? It's like the project goes from green to red, or its reporting is green when it's really red. Whereas if somebody was to report when a risk started to become realized or become apparent, hey, we need to degrade this to amber. Then there would be less of a surprise and less of a problem. So it just stays green up until there's a surprise moment, usually right before the delivery deadline or the target project end date, and then we flip it to red. So, I mean, does that align with what you think of as a watermelon project, or is there anything else that you think is like a key characteristic?
Yeah, I think that covers it broadly, right? And I think that this is always going to change a little bit depending on the organization and the purpose of the rag chart within the organization. So the one caveat I'll put here with like unrealized risks or unrecognized risks, and this is maybe a bit more of an opinion thing for me, but in my opinion, if you're going to move an engagement to amber or red, it means that there's something you can do about it, right? Um, so oftentimes, and this I would not classify as a watermelon project. So oftentimes, when you escalate at any sort of project, at almost any organization I've been at, if I flip a project from green to yellow or green to red, something happens, right? It's kind of the Humpty Dumpty thing, right? I move from green to yellow and yellow to red, right? And all the king's horses and all the king's men come and help me out, or at least that's the way it's supposed to be, as it should be a generative and helpful thing. Sometimes you might see some risks, some things that are throwing off your spidey senses, right? But there's nothing you can do about them. They're either going to be realized and we'll intervene, or they're not going to be realized, so we're not going to intervene. And oftentimes I do see people, and I think the organization incentivizes this, who do nothing, right? The appropriate course of action is to wait and see if these risks are real. Because if I call Ed to escalate for my hypothetical, these might be risks, then all I'm doing is kind of crying wolf when there's nothing out in the pasture, right? So I do think we do need to, as we go through this conversation, parse through some of those hypotheticals and realize that like sometimes we get some known unknowns, can't do a lot about known unknowns. We can put them in a register. I don't think that they often escalate to the point of changing the color on projects, because if there's nothing you can do about it, then you're just saying this might blow up, and I don't want to take responsibility for it blowing up. And I don't think that that's a good move.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you there because if it's almost, I mean, it's kind of the same thing, right? Where it's like, well, maybe there's not much I can do about it, but I see that it might impact the project timeline or what we are able to deliver or whatever. And so I generally do err on the side of like, I'm going to move this to amber. And I guess I think of risks as there are some that are, oh, I don't know, for lack of a better phrasing, like there's some that are material risks that
Mhm.
definitely need to, we need to open a ticket, we need to call, or, in Empower, whatever system you use, we need to get the sales manager or somebody involved in this so that we can start figuring out how we might deal with it. And then there are those kind of like, oh, this thing wasn't installed yet, but the team's working on it and they're expecting it to be installed the end of the week or whatever, where I might call those out on a status report and just say like, hey,
Mhm.
we're dealing with this week to week, but I wouldn't necessarily elevate that up to the project level for reporting. But I mean, if those are still, even if those risks are ones we might be dealing with, I might still flag the project as amber just to say like, hey, there's uncertainty with these risks right now. And until we have more certainty or we know what
Yeah.
is going to happen with them, like we are at risk right now. And I don't want anybody to think we're green when we're not even sure if we're green right now.
Yeah, and I'd put that, and I know we want to move on from this at some point here, but um remembering scaled agile calls it roaming risks, right? When they go through their program increment planning. And I think that that's actually a really good mechanism. So for anyone listening, that's resolve, own, accepted, or mitigated. And I think resolved, owned, and accepted, right? Especially accepted risks are liner notes on your updates. They're not pieces that need to get escalated, right? If we know that, you know, there's no other way to go through this project other than to have X number of dependencies. We know that each dependency reduces the likelihood of project success by 50% for all intents and purposes, right? Because it's a binary on whether or not that dependency gets hit. That's an accepted risk. And we can go in and say, hey, this is a high risk project because of all of this. There's nothing that we can do about it. Like that's just table stakes out of the gate.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess, so we can ground this a little bit more so our listeners know we have been through this before. I know I have one really specific example that always comes to mind for me with watermelons, projects, and if you have one, I'd love to hear about it too. But the one for me that comes to mind is, there was a project I was working on many years ago that was gonna be crossing multiple systems and multiple departments, and it involved, a lot of data and specific types of data, that were owned by different data teams, and my team needed to use it for the systems we were working on, and there was, oh, at least 3 or 4 or 5 other teams that were involved in this. It was a pretty large cross team, cross department, cross org project because it was trying to change, kind of data integrity and how we made data available and who could use it and who could access it and all of that. And and I mean, I wish I had taken better notes when it was happening, so I would have all of the details still top of mind. But the main thing that sticks to me was I remember sitting in a meeting where, the new it was and it was relatively early on in the project, but the project manager was, asking at the end of the call, like we went through the normal stuff and said, "Hey, does any, are there any risks, anything anybody wants to call out?" And I, flagged and I spoke to the whole, I think there was probably 30 people in this meeting because we were trying to do some high level planning across groups. And I said, well, look, there's this risk, like there's this problem with the data that we've uncovered talking to these data owners, and there's this data owner with this set of data and this other data owner with this set of data, and the way that this data, like matches each other, and whatever. There's like a big problem here that nobody seems to know how to get to the bottom of, and I think this is a major risk for the success of this overall effort. And I remember, because it was so frustrating, the project manager just kind of like paused, and there was like a long pause, and then they said, "All right, well, I guess we'll call it green. Thanks everyone," and they like closed the call and ended it. And I was like, and then months later, no surprise, we were nowhere close to being done in the time frame that was planned for it, and everybody acted like this was some huge surprise, and it was all, in large part because of the data issues that I had called out and been calling out this whole time. And I remember that was just the most frustrating thing for me, and it was also frustrating for all of leadership who had this. I mean, I was telling my manager and my director, like, "Hey, there's risks for this. I don't think this is actually green. I think we're going to have problems here." But other groups of leadership were seeing green reports and thinking that this thing was on track and going to be taken care of. And so for them, it was a big surprise. And I don't know what the circumstances were, or what that PM, perspective was, that they just kind of, in my opinion, they felt like they ignored what I was raising as a very real and material risk. So it might not have been malicious, but a lot of people were surprised by that. So that for me is the quintessential example of a watermelon project in my career. Do you have any that come to mind for you?
Um, I mean, more more than I can name. Well, because I think most projects, whether we acknowledge it or not, usually end up with a segment of time where they're not green. Right? There's always some unknown unknowns that come up in the middle of them. Um, and I think it's a matter of, are we going to fight our way through this? Are we going to accomplish what we set out to accomplish on the timeline we set out to accomplish it or not? I think one of the mistakes that we often make, or hedges, maybe it's not even a mistake, maybe it's just a hedge, is that, if you've been through this a lot, you realize that the effort and the stress of most projects kind of mirrors a hockey stick, where it just goes up a whole bunch near the end, right? Deadlines are great motivators, and we seem to pull the results, out of our backside. I think oftentimes, like, a PM like that is probably banking on that happening, not realizing if they're in too deep. But yeah, I'm looking forward to unpacking some of the other ways that this happens.
Yeah. Well, before we get into why we think this happens, I'm curious. Do you think that this is a unique phenomenon to large enterprises, which is where I've mostly worked, and especially with like their heavy reporting structures, or do you think that this happens a lot in smaller organizations as well?
um, I think it's pretty ubiquitous for all things, for projects, right? I don't My suspicion is that it's maybe more common with larger projects just as a result of complexity and the number of things that can go wrong, right? So if we just use simple analogies, right, it's a lot simpler to paint my office than it is to build my house, right? So the number of things that can go wrong, the number of things that can cause delays, right, or to throw things out of alignment are just, exponentially larger. But I think anytime that we're doing projects, there's the risk of this happening. And I think part of that risk is that as project leaders, it's our job to get it done. And oftentimes that means showing that we are getting it done, right? Our project status reporting is part of the way that we show that we're getting it done. I think one of the other things too is I think you see it less in organizations with strong and secure leadership, and more in organizations with weak or insecure leadership. I think a higher psychological safety is a lower prevalence of watermelon projects. I think it also depends on what the organization's mechanisms are to fix those watermelon projects, right? So I've been some places where escalating, you get the Humpty Dumpty escalation, you get all the king's horses, you get all the king's men, and it's helpful and it resolves and you sleep better at night. I've been in other organizations where escalating doubles the workload for the same output, in which case, intrinsically you should be saying that this is yellow or this is red, but you know that it's just going to make your job harder for no upside. So the incentive structure is not aligned with the behavior that the organization wants.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I fundamentally agree. Like, I do think this is a universal problem and can happen at any size of organization. But I do think it's probably typically going to be worse in big corporations or big enterprises. But I think that the reason for that is it's the scale. It's like the number of dependencies that you have. And if you remember the math on dependencies, it's like if you if you have one dependency, there's only a 50% chance of you succeeding. And if you have like three dependencies, it winds up only being, like a 1 in 16 or 1 in 32 chance of you actually succeeding in the time frame. So when you have
Right. And that's
dependencies,
assuming that each dependency is a binary, right? So if you have one dependency, it's either going to work or it's not going to work.
right?
If you have two, you need both of those binaries, like both of those coin tosses to flip heads in order, right? That's the way that's broken out, correct?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And even worse, if you have, oh well, we've got three dependencies that are all binary, yes or no. Is it on time or is it not? That's going to help us deliver. But then if each of them has one or two or three dependencies, then the math gets even blown out even more. So,
Right.
huge corporations, it's usually a lot of like segregation of duties and all kinds of things that wind up creating these big dependency chains or dependency cascades, which when one of them fails, it's just a cascading failure and it collapses all the way down. So I think that's definitely part of it. I think big corporations sometimes are worse because there often is more of a like more eyes on you or whatever, more
Hmm.
scrutiny if you do report something like that. So there's going to be a lot more people that are bugging you, or all of a sudden all this extra process and things that get put on top, which if you already have a full workload and you're doing your best to manage the project or the risks, all that extra overhead doesn't help anything. And then I think the other thing just with a larger organization is it almost gives you plausible deniability in some ways because it's like, well, I didn't know about this, so therefore I couldn't have known that this problem was going to happen or whatever. And if you so there's almost like a maybe a little bit of a temptation to cover things up the larger that the organization is. Which I guess, we've kind of already started talking about this, but let's get into the why. Why do we think watermelons projects happen? What kind of incentives or what's the psychology behind it? I don't really understand when I think about it just from my own experience and my own perspective. I don't know why any rational person would choose to hide bad news. I've always been a believer in like give bad news early, as early as possible, because then it doesn't
Bad
surprise
news
anybody.
travels poorly.
Yeah. And it's a
Or
lot easier
ages
to deal
poorly for
with.
sure.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, what I mean,
I think,
what's your take on the psychology? Do you think, like, rational people who know a project is in trouble, what do you think makes them choose not to report it as green?
yeah, I think it comes down to what the mechanisms in place are and what the incentives those mechanisms drive are, right? So broadly speaking, right, most places, most managers, most leaders want to hear that the project is on time because that's the good news. Um, but what the mitigation techniques and what the escalation looks like has a huge impact on people's willingness to report it, right? And I think like there's two things at play. One is we always kind of pull ourselves out of these nosedives, so we're going to pull ourselves out of this nosedive again, right? So it's just like, oh, I've been around the block a couple of times. I know that we're going to go through this trough of despair across the timeline of this project, and we'll pull ourselves out. And as long as we focus on the business outcomes that we're trying to accomplish, more likely than not this is going to be okay.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes
um
things do just kinda, like, it's almost like they just work themselves out as you
yeah,
get further
yeah,
into the project or further into the work.
right. um Oftentimes, right, we build in these projects with a certain amount of buffer, whether that's a number of weeks or a percentage of effort, or whatever, if we're talking about like a fixed time and materials kind of project. So there's usually some slack associated with that we're trying to or that we have that we can consume in order to do that. So until we start seeing that slack really taken up, it's not that big of an issue, right? That's kind of the figure it out. But it also depends too, like what happens at your organization when you escalate something to amber or red. Do you get punished for it? Do you get helped for it? Do you get praised for it? Right? All of these things are wildly different. And and it's not just a matter of what your organization says they do or what they do on their best day. It's what they do on their worst day. So
Yeah.
like I worked at a group for a while where we celebrated escalation. We were very escalatory, and we took a lot of pride in that because you got help, you got the support that you needed. But then in the back room, when you're doing performance evals, the group manager is saying, "Oh, well, Ed had 5 red projects this year, and that doesn't seem like a coincidence. So we should put him here in the performance ranking." Um, that erodes the trust that you're trying to do, right? That's going to increase the likelihood that more subterfuge happens because people are going to figure that out. And super transparently, sometimes it is Ed's fault that he's got a bunch of red projects, right? If Ed's slacking off or asleep at the wheel, it could be Ed's fault. But
Well,
also,
not my
Ed could
fault, a
be
different
doing,
Ed.
yeah. Oh, I'm just using you to protect the names of the guilty here. Um, but also, Ed could be doing a bang up job and also still end up with 5 red projects because they were scoped poorly or staffed poorly, or you know because the project was doomed from the beginning and somebody sold something that the client didn't actually want or need, and that's not Ed's fault, right?
Yeah.
Like, you as a yeah, I'm thinking, yeah, from a professional services, consulting delivery background, you're kind of handed the statement of work that you're handed, and it's your job to do the best you can with it. And if you got handed a turd sandwich, I don't care how much mayo you put on it, it's still a turd sandwich,
Yeah.
right? So I think that those parts of the organization and the organizational structure have a huge impact on the density of watermelon projects.
Yeah,
What
a
about
couple
you?
a couple of things I was thinking about, and ahead of time, and also that came up as you were talking was, um, for folks who are listening, if you've ever seen Silicon Valley, there's an episode, I forget what episode it is, but there's an episode where, they're trying to have a release date for something, and like the CEO has announced that it's going to be, we're going to go live, and I think it was like a UFC fight, they were going to, host it live or whatever, and they're way behind, they can't, they're not going to be able to stream it, like the whole system isn't going to work right. And there's this whole scene where somebody goes, did he just say it's going to be ready by, January 20th? Like there's no way, we're way behind. And then the boss who he's
We're at
talking to,
least 2 weeks
yeah,
behind.
2 weeks behind that, and the boss goes, "Oh, are you gonna tell him that? Because 'Cause I'm not gonna tell him that." And then the boss walks off to talk to, like, somebody else who goes, "Wait, did he just say we're only 2 weeks behind? We're having problems with this and this and this and this. We're at least 6 weeks behind." And that person says, "Well, are you gonna tell him? I'm not gonna tell him." And it just keeps going up, and it turns out, by the time they get to the last person, they're actually, like, 6 months or a year behind schedule, but nobody is willing to tell the people above them because they don't wanna be the person to tell them. Um, but then when you compare that to, you talked about places where being red or switching to red is almost like a good thing. And that makes me think of, well, firstly, it makes me think of Toyota, who they have their manufacturing line and they have andon cords, which is basically a stoppage, a work stoppage cord at every single workstation all the way down the line. So any employee on that line who's doing the manufacturing can pull the cord and it does a complete line stoppage all at once. And then all of the line managers, they basically swarm at whatever station the andon cord was pulled to find out what the problem is and then work to resolve it as quickly as possible. And so that maybe bolts have a defect in them that they can't get screwed in. Well, if you just let the line keep running, you're going to have a bunch of rework or a bunch of faulty parts, things like that. And so by pulling the line, it helps them swarm and solve the problem. So it's actually better if you pull the line than if you don't. And they want to see more pulls than less. And it kind of
And
aligns with, I've heard about this in
and
hospitals.
am I mistaken? I recall hearing that there was that like if it's found out that there's something where you should have like if you saw the bolts were faulty and you didn't pull the on cord, like there's a punitive action or something
Oh,
like it's
probably.
basically flipped, right? Like the
Yeah.
culture is flipped so that your incentive is to pull even if it's a false positive on the full pull rather than letting a potential defect go through.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. They would rather have false pulls that were not necessary that stopped the line rather than not doing it. So they would err on the side of doing it. And it's the same for, I remember reading about, there was something that said like hospitals who when hospital staff reports more um like issues or whatever, they actually have better outcomes than hospitals that report fewer issues. And it all just lines up with that idea of like, well, we're either keeping things quiet and to ourselves, or we're raising them up and getting everybody's attention on them and doing something about it.
Mhm.
So, I think that really stands out to me. I guess as far as why these things happen at the orgs, I think you've kind of said a lot of them. There's the fear of red. I think in a lot of cases, red doesn't trigger help. It triggers like scrutiny and judgment and like, well, what did you do wrong or how did you fail? So if that's
Yeah.
always what's going to happen, then of course I would rather report green than red if everybody's going to get on my back about it when I'm maybe trying to do my best and trying to accomplish things. It also is, and it may not be fear in that same punitive way, but there's also, you kind of mentioned this, where if I flip something to yellow or red and somebody goes, "Oh, hey, we saw that. How can we support you? What do you need from us?" That for me is probably going to be a lot better of a situation than if as soon as I flip it, I get 13 meetings on my calendar with different levels of people and, "Oh, well, can you do this report? Can you do this document and this form?" And in that case, I'm basically being punished for flipping to amber or red. It's not in the same way as like the punitive punishment, but I am essentially being punished for reporting that
Yeah.
there's a problem.
And and that's one of those things too, like I've built a couple of these systems, Ed, and my general take is that If I'm asking a project leader for anything that isn't part of their just normal day-to-day stuff, whether that's reporting or, data or whatever, then our normal day-to-day data and reporting is insufficient, right? If you're like, oh, Ed flipped this to red, now I might ask for it earlier, right? Like,
Sure. Hmm.
what's, okay, it's the third week of the month, not the fourth week of the month, but I want your budget now. I would expect that more likely than not, you're updating that on roughly a weekly basis, not a monthly basis anyway. Otherwise, like just having done those. Um, and not every org that works that way, but in my opinion, I should ask you for all of your normal tracking as up to date as you can get it. And then the only additional thing I should be asking you for is what does your path to green look like? Right. Um, which I think a lot of folks, yeah, you get 13 meetings on your calendar, you get all this other stuff, and it feels super punitive or like a huge lift just to write a lot of people in on the information. And um, leaders out there, it's incumbent upon, like, you can ask the project leader for access to the information. Don't ask them to read it to you,
Yeah.
right? Get
Yeah.
up to speed on your time and then be useful. Otherwise, you're just gumming things up.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. Something else that I was thinking about was so we were talking about, well, sometimes projects are kind of a mess up front, and then you learn more and uncover stuff, and they work themselves out. And I think another psychological thing that I think is the flip side of that, or like the negative version of that, is I guess I would almost call it like a hero complex type of trap, where I think sometimes what happens is people who are working on the project, they go, oh, there's these risks and these problems, but I think I can save this, right? If I work nights, if I work weekends, I can catch up, I can keep it green. And we might be behind right now, but if I keep working on this, we'll be able to catch up, and we'll be able to fix it. So there's no reason to even report that we're going amber or we're trending red or anything, because I think we can fix it. I think that's a big risk, because, well, certainly there's the risk of burnout and all of that. Like, you can't really work the problem out all the time without killing yourself. But then, beyond that, what if you don't save it? And so now you get to the end, you've now spent nights and weekends working, you're working, 60-hour weeks or whatever, and it still doesn't meet the deadline, and it still goes red, and now everybody's surprised. And now maybe you're, getting that scrutiny that we talked about. But maybe if you had, and now you're tired and stressed and getting the scrutiny, whereas if you had just raised the concern earlier, and, maybe you could say, well, I think I could, if I work some extra hours, maybe I can manage this or whatever. Like, that might be a conversation to consider having, but it's the conversation, right? Without the conversation, you're kind of
Mhm.
working in this vacuum, and then uh, using up all your energy and surprising people, and then feeling surprised yourself when it doesn't work out the way that you wanted. So I think that's another um, kind of reason that sometimes people think, like, oh, this will work itself out. Well, if I work harder, it'll work itself out. And I don't think that's really a great place to be either.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah.
And then the last one I was thinking about is I think there's something to be said about budget rigidity and like focusing on time and on budget. And I think especially in terms of like B2B sales and things like that. Um, I think what can happen a lot of the time is when you have pressure to be on time and on budget, it often forces or defaults teams and individuals to report to the plan rather than reporting reality, right? And I think it's
Mhm.
that question of like, well, are we working the plan, or are we working reality as it comes up and then updating the plan to account for that? And I think too often a plan gets locked in early, and then everybody does whatever they can to match the plan, rather than saying, hey, this plan doesn't match reality, or these things are not working out the way that we expected, and we need to revise, like, this plan is not a good plan. I think there's a lot of fear around that, and a lot of organizations don't have good they don't always have good systems or processes in place for, once I realize that we're not on track with the plan, what do I do? I think that's something that's missing from a lot of teams.
Yeah, I think that that also comes down to how do we think about projects overall, and this is something, yeah, I've been talking with my peers at my org about this a lot lately, as far as like enabling people to think in these contexts. Is like when you set out to do a project, right? The project might be build a widget, right? And the widget is well defined and well scoped. But when people work straight to the plan, they're often just focusing on 6 inches in front of their nose, and they're saying, I was brought in here to build a widget. What we should be thinking about is, what is that widget trying to accomplish? What is this the solution that we're actually looking to accomplish? And that's a much better metric of success. And I think when we're talking even about like, watermelon projects, red, amber, green, right? Like, look, I've had plenty of time and materials projects where we had a fixed scope where we were going to accomplish XYZ goals, but those goals were in service of something way larger. And as long as you accomplish the intent of those goals, you're going to be in really good shape, right? Right, as long as you're in service of that larger thing. So you might not hit the widget exactly as scoped as it's defined, but if the widget you built solves the business need that it was hired to solve, doing great, right? And I think we need to always be thinking about that, right? It's like, what are we doing this for? What is this in service of? And I think a lot of folks get lost in the weeds, and they just don't want to do the heavier lifting to think of like, oh, I was brought in to do this project. They don't think about how that project integrates with anything else, or why that project was brought in, or set after to begin with, right? It's just like, oh, we have to do this, and we have to do it on this timeline, and this is what it needs to look like. And look, we're talking mostly about working in the software space, right? It's not building a house, it's not architecture, it's not building a bridge, right? There are 1,000 different ways to go solve that problem. So think about the problem that you're going to solve, not the mechanism by which you're solving it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um, I think so let's talk some more about the impact and what people can do to fix this sort of thing. And
Hmm.
I think and we probably talked about this in our bureaucracy episode when we recorded that one. Is I think the natural instinct for people is to think if they're facing this problem, the solution is more bureaucracy or more process or more reporting or whatever. And I think we could both agree that if we're using watermelon as the analogy, more bureaucracy just means you have a thicker rind, right? It just
Yeah.
means like the project's still going to be red on the outs and on the inside. It's going to be green on the outside. We're just going to suddenly have thicker, more steps that people have to take, more process, more actions that people have to do, which in fact is going to make people less inclined to flag something as being at risk or going to red than more inclined to do so, because you're basically saying, oh, you have a problem, here's a bunch more work that gets thrown on your plate to do it. So I think that with all of that in mind, I think the way that we can as leaders stop this is we move from better reporting to better culture, right? Because when
Mhm.
something like this happens, it's not just that the delivery is late and the project misses and we're over budget or whatever. It's also eroded trust, right? It could be if this is all internal projects, all of a sudden the director doesn't trust this manager because the reporting wasn't right, and the manager doesn't trust the project manager, or doesn't trust the delivery team as much anymore because they were saying it was green all this time, and then they got surprised, and then the shit flowed uphill basically, and they just kept having more and more people get frustrated and not believe that it's gonna that they can be successful in the future. So it's like a cycle of distrust. And not only do they not trust each other, but people are going to start not trusting the reports. They're going to get a green report and it's going to be like, oh, do I really trust this thing? It's probably actually red and they're not reporting to me. Well, we better add more process, or we better have a meeting
Mhm.
here where this manager now talks to this project manager to confirm if the report's actually green or whatever. And then it's just this what's the opposite of a virtuous cycle? It's like the
A
reverse.
vicious, yeah.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle where now we're adding more and more process. People hide the truth more and more because they don't want to be on the chopping block or be subject to all of these extra rules. Um, and I think overall what this just leads to is burnout and failure at all sorts of levels across the organization. Do you see anything else as like a major cost of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it always comes down to culture there, right? And if we want people to report clearly, you have to create that psychological safety, right? You have to make sure that, like, look, sometimes everyone does everything that they're supposed to do and things go off the rails because a mistake happened upstream, or there was an unknown unknown, or a series of unknown unknowns. And as a leader, you can't go in with a punitive um approach, right? A postmortem is useful for these sorts of things, right? Looking back and figuring out why it happened, but you need to be going into that and figuring out how to do that without placing blame. And you need to build that psychological trust and that psychological safety so that when you escalate, when things go red, when you do a postmortem, people don't think that they're getting fired, right?
Yeah. The blameless
Otherwise,
blameless postmortem. You have to come in like everyone did the best they could with the information they had at the time, and we assume everyone tried their best, and there's no point in like pointing fingers or placing blame because as a DevOps culture would tell us, it's like, well, if something bad was allowed to happen, it's not necessarily the fault of the people, or most of the time it's not the fault of the people, it's the fault of the system for allowing that failure to happen in the first place.
mhm. And I think I told you about this at at another point, maybe outside of the scope of these podcasts. But I have a pretty good friend who works in medical research and development. He literally is trying to make cancer drugs, and he and his team do not get evaluated on whether or not they cured cancer this year. They get evaluated on whether or not they did good science this year, right? Whether or not their hypotheses were sound, their approaches were sound, right? And I think we need to keep that into consideration, right? If if I was Ed and I walked into this project with Ed's background and experience and with the data that Ed had, would I have made different decisions? Right? Oftentimes the answer is no, and the question is, what different data or information should we have had that could have prevented this thing from happening, and how could we go about getting that?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think, also just this idea of redefining and reframing what red means in the context of your organization or your teams. We talked about the Toyota Andon cord earlier, but I mean, I think that's like the quintessential example of how to make this work successfully. Stopping the line is a positive act of quality control. No one ever gets in trouble for pulling the line, and in fact, you'll be more in trouble in quotes if you don't pull it, then and a problem is discovered later that you knew about than if you did. So I think that I think is really what it comes down to for me is that we need to, as leaders, we need to make sure that it's clear to our people, to our teams, that red doesn't mean failure. Red means I think I need some help or support or resources. And sometimes and I don't think that that should automatically trigger a here's the support and the help and the resources. It should be like a what help, support, and resources do you need, or what can we help you with? Because I mean, a really good project manager or a really good team might know that it's red and they can still work around it or find ways to manage it or mitigate those risks. And they don't necessarily need any other help, but they wanted to report an accurate status. And so I think that that's really a key thing. And we should think about it the way, if a pilot is flying and they get a warning light, they're not going to tape over it and just ignore it. They're gonna land, they're gonna call air traffic control, they're gonna get the help that they need. And I think that's the same kind of mindset and approach that we should be taking for all of this. So, definitely the blameless reporting and rewarding early warning signs, and like you had said with the sending over reports and stuff, and then like the leader being like, well, hey, walk me through all of this. Well, leaders should be doing spot checking or auditing, or, like the status reports that are coming out, they should be checking in on that. And if something smells fishy, they should be following up on it and not waiting until it flips red for it to become a
Yeah.
problem. So, how about you? Is there anything that you can think of for how you would stop this, or anything that you've changed for how you react to bad news when someone brings a red status? Do you think you help or interrogate, or how do you make it safe?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the key thing is to be helpful, right? And to approach it as like, look, let's start with where we are, right? Then how do we fix it? What do we need to do to fix it, right? And then we can talk about how we got there. Because sometimes applying the fix tells you everything you need to know about how you got there too, right? So
Hmm.
I think it's just a matter of like remain calm, right? I think as a leader, your job is to bring the temperature in the room down, not to rise the temperature. Um, and I think that that's how you build a culture that's willing to escalate and does so early and often. um you know and and it's also like ideally your team is bringing you escalations that you don't need and you're just like, oh yeah, this will be fine, right? Like that's fine too, right? That's not like, then you're looped in, right? A lot of things, like there are things that work themselves out, right? Acknowledge that you don't need to go and cut butter with a chainsaw every time, and oftentimes we kind of get ourselves stuck into that loop.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've talked a lot about this, and I think we've talked about some things that our listeners can do. But I did make a list of a few things that I was thinking about to share with our listeners that they could take away and do tomorrow or next week that might make a difference and help prevent or avoid these types of watermelon projects in the future. Um, so the first thing would be, I think a lot of times when we see green on a status report, we just kind of accept it really casually, and that's okay most of the time, I imagine. But if you're ever facing this problem of like, oh, it's green and surprise something went red, then a good step would be just to, even when it is green, to say, what's one thing that might kill our date? What's one thing that might cause us problems? And if they can't list anything, then that might be a smell that, unless they're really confident, oh, everything's on track and everything's, in its place and where it needs to be, then that might be a good sign. But if you start to get the weird smell that they can't answer that, or you feel like something's being hidden or whatever, then you might need to just dig deeper to
Mhm,
understand it. And so, it's not about saying I don't trust my people and don't accept what's on the report, but it's just having that kind of discernment to evaluate what's going on and be willing to ask questions with, and not just accept green as like the, hey, everything's good, don't need to worry about it, let's move on.
mhm.
So
and
you could
and
also
with
ask.
that,
Oh yeah.
yeah, one of the reporting mechanisms that I have my teams do is a monthly portfolio report, and it's got a section that's customer highlights and lowlights. And the rule, it's space bound, so it is literally a box that they have to fill in. They have to fit within that box. But the rule is, for every highlight you need to have a corresponding low light across your portfolio. And if you the way that we respond with them is, if you try to do the, oh, I'm going to turn a weakness into a strength thing, you're going to get your wrist slapped for that, because we want transparency, right? This is like, that's the whole point of it. This isn't a vanity report. This is an objective report. And yeah, that's one of those ways that you can kind of create that objectivity, is by making things like that a requirement, right? In a status report, you need to, put your three highlights and three lowlights of the last, XYZ time period. With that as like a transparency rule, which means that you, as Mr. or Miss Leader, have to read the report and comment on the report.
Hmm.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. um Yeah, and I mean, I think that kind of one other note that I had here was, um, just asking, especially when you've got long running projects or things that maybe even when you're just getting started, but you could ask, what's the biggest risk that isn't showing up yet? So trying to think ahead, or almost take that pre-mortem type of stance. So it's like, what problems could we face? What might come up? And if you take the pre-mortem to its logical conclusion, then you would say, well, when we're in kickoff, or when we're in planning or whatever, you want to take those steps to look far ahead. Oh, let's say it's the end of the project, or let's say it's 6 months from now, and we failed, or 6 months from now and we're way off track. What happened that caused us to fail and not hit our project date, or what happened for us to get so far off track 6 months into this 1 year project. And by doing something like that, that basically is granting permission for people to voice the potential red risks early. And one thing I love about the pre-mortem is that as soon as you get that list of potential risks that could be challenging the team, and you could even do this with the team in that same session, you start saying like, well, what could we do to prevent this risk from even happening in the first place? And then, or if this risk were to be realized or materialized, what could we do to be prepared to deal with it? And then that way, you're not when or if they do turn into real risks or realized risks, it's not a surprise to anyone. You've already kind of mentally thought about how to deal with it, and you have some ideas that you can just pull out of the backlog or the hat or whatever, and say, oh, we talked about this at the beginning of the project. This could have happened, but we had this great plan to deal with it. Let's see if we can take this plan forward and deal with it. So I think digging deeper and trying to do the pre-mortem, but the pre-mortem is only going to work if you change the signal, right? So I think this is another tip would be, find some way as a leader to publicly state to your team, red doesn't mean you failed. It means that you need something. And just stating it though is not enough. You need to demonstrate it as well. It's all good to say it in a team meeting, and then the next day somebody's project flips red, and all of a sudden they're in 10 extra meetings, and they have to do all the documentation and plans and stuff like that. But if you actually show you tell them, if something bad happens, we will be there to support you. That's what we're here for. And then when a bad thing happens, you actually demonstrate that you're going to provide them the support they need and not have it be punitive. Then that's how the team knows for sure that it is safe to report things as red, and take the right steps and the right actions to move forward. And I guess
Mm.
connected to that would be, you tell them, you show them, and then also you reward them for bringing you the bad news early, right? Thank them, maybe even thank them publicly. I know we've talked in the past about whether public praise is always good or not, but this might be a case where you want to show everyone, like, thanks so much for bringing this risk up early. Because you brought it up, we were able to manage it before it became a problem. And that's just one more way to change that signal and really show that red is safe. So those are
Yeah.
what I came up with. Anything else that comes to mind for you that you think people could change tomorrow that would help them with this?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to action, Ed, right? It comes down to what do you do when it turns red, and how do you make sure that people know that this is something that's designed for help, right? It's not going to make your life materially worse if you're a project leader and you have something red. Not any worse than having a red project is, right? Like, let's put a caveat of that. Having a red project kind of sucks. Right, but your job as a leader is to reduce that suck. And then as you're trying to shift the culture, it's finding ways to make that clear, right? And that could be, you know, it could be praise, it could be writing and publishing a correction of errors of, like, this is what happened, this is what we learned, this is what we did. It's a matter of doing those things and, you know, showing as much transparency through the whole process as you possibly can.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great place to wrap up. So to close this out, watermelon projects usually happen because people want to succeed. They hope they can fix the problems before anyone notices. But as leaders, our job isn't to demand perfect reports, it's to create an environment where we can handle the imperfect reality together. So here's your challenge this week. Look at your green projects and ask yourself, are they green because the work is done or going to be done, or are they green because the team feels they have to be green? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Email us at leadershipexplored@gmail.com or connect with us on LinkedIn. Thanks for exploring leadership with us today. We release new episodes every other Tuesday. Until next time, keep leading with purpose.